Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well, well, well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Bong. I hope that you're all having a wonderful weekend. Today is Sunday, September 13th, and I've got a very fun show for you guys today because we're going to get a little bit of a taste of what's to come in October. I am a very big horror movie fan. I will still be watching new movies, but throughout most of October, I'm probably going to be almost exclusively watching horror movies. That's what I like to do in October. Save all of them up for the Halloween season. But there was a newer, somewhat of a horror movie that came out this past weekend. So I figured I would review that one for you guys and then have a little bit of a taste of what's to come in the next month and talk about some horror movies for today. So that's what today's theme is. It's going to be a little more fun than just horror. It's going to be more satirical horror, some more sort of like goofy comedy horror in a way. So it's going to be a little bit different of an episode because I'm not actually going to start with the newer movie because the newer movie is a sequel, and I also wanted to review the first one because that was my weekly watch. So we're going to start with my weekly watch, which is The Babysitter, a film from 2 years ago, a Netflix original. And then we're going to go into the newer movie, which is the sequel that came out this past Friday called The Babysitter Killer Queen. And finally, my weekly recommendation is called Ready or Not. And then stay tuned until the very end of the episode where I run down my top 5 horror satires of all time. So let's get started. Alright, so The Babysitter is a 2017 Netflix original directed by McG, and starring Judah Lewis and Samara Weaving. It basically follows a young kid who spies on his babysitter and her friends late at night to discover a sacrificial blood ritual. Oh, it's a little nuts, and it's very violent, and I love it. So this movie, a lot of people are not big fans of. Overall, I think the consensus is like 60%. People are generally kind of lukewarm on it. I have a lot of personal friends. I have one friend who is very into it, along with myself, and I have a couple friends who are really not into it at all. I think this movie is realistically a total hit or miss for people. It depends on how you go into it. So this entire episode is going to be somewhat horror satire. I don't think this is by any means the smartest horror satire out there. I wouldn't even really classify it among some of the other movies I might be talking about today. But I do think that there is a fair amount of self-referential behavior in this movie. I think it's pretty aware of what it is and what it's trying to do. It's really just a really fun gore fest that has some really creative moments and some really fun chemistry. And I think it's just one of those movies that you should watch with some friends and have a good time. Don't take it too seriously. It really doesn't take itself too seriously. I went into this movie initially thinking I was really going to dislike it because most of my friends up until that point were not very big fans of it. And I think some people, I guess it's kind of debated whether or not it's being self-aware or whether or not it knows the jokes that it's being made, and so whether you're supposed to laugh with it or laugh at it. I'm definitely of the caliber that I think it is self-aware. I think maybe there's some moments that are a bit more cringeworthy than they should be in sort of that self-referential category, but I still think it knows what it's trying to do. By no means is it subversive for the genre. It's not going to be remembered as this sort of like challenge to the form. Think like Scream, for example. So I just think it's really one of those fun, schlocky horror movies that's really perfect for the month of October. And so this will get you kind of hyped up for that. And so this is not the new movie for anybody that's just starting to listen. This is actually my weekly watch. I went back and rewatched this one because the sequel just came out. So that's the newer movie, and I wanted to review that second just in case people had seen this one and not seen The Babysitter Killer Queen, and so wanted to wait a little bit. Or if you just want to listen to these reviews and maybe are not sold on the movie yet or don't want to watch it at all, I wanted to make sure people have the context of this first one before we get into the second one, because I feel like it'd be a little bit backwards to review them backwards, if that makes sense. But let's just start talking about this movie, because I think it's really, really fun. And that's going to be the word that I use the most. It's not taking itself seriously at all, at least from what I can tell. There are definitely some actors in this who I think are probably taking it a bit too seriously. So I'm going to start with the acting. I'll do the screenplay probably a little bit hand in hand, because if you know me, I think the most important part of a movie to me is both the screenplay and the acting. Most specifically the screenplay. But the two of them work in tandem a lot of times. And so I kind of think that the screenplay and in some places the acting is probably the weakest part of this movie. But overall, the movie is just so charming in a lot of its other aspects that I can kind of forgive it. So starting with that acting, the core of this movie is Judah Lewis and Samara Weaving. So Judah Lewis is our main character, Cole, and he carries most of the film. It's really about, for the bulk of it, his relationship with his babysitter, who's played by Samara Weaving. Her name in the movie is B. So Cole and B have this sort of buddy cop relationship in the beginning of the film. So Cole is supposed to be playing a 15-year-old kid who is just starting out in high school, and he sort of has this codependent relationship with his babysitter, and it's referenced many times in the movie that he's too old for having a babysitter, ultimately. And what I really like is that the chemistry between these two is really strong. So it's established from the beginning. It's within the first couple scenes. We get multiple scenes with the two of them. And so we're really rooting for their relationship, obviously not in a romantic sense, even though Cole looks up to her in that way. It's pretty clear that that's not the direction the movie's going to go, but we're rooting for this relationship to succeed, for both of these two main characters to come out on top in some way or the other. So when we get the moment pretty early on, this is part of the synopsis that I gave, so this is by no means a spoiler. It's in the trailer. Once we actually see sort of the murder cult start, we're rooting for B to be this good guy, even though it's pretty clear that she currently is not, or probably won't end up that way. And so I thought that was really smart to build that relationship. I think both of these two actors are very strong, particularly for the script that they're given. I'm kind of insulting the script, even though I really like it. I do think it's pretty charming, but some of their lines are probably a little bit difficult to deliver, and a lot of that chemistry is just character work as opposed to actual dialogue. So there are some scenes that play off each other very well. There's a scene really early on where they're in the kitchen. It does feel a little bit scripted, but I do think that these actors give really their best performance in a film like this that really doesn't even call for a performance like that. It calls mostly just for the actors to be having fun, which all the other actors, you can tell that they are having fun, but they're really giving it their all. In this scene in particular, but in all of the scenes, these two actors, you can tell they've done a lot of character work and have depth to their characters that we, the audience, might never know. And so I think that they do a lot of legwork in this movie, and it really shows, and it definitely really pays off. The two actors that I think are the weakest link in here are Bella Thorne and Andrew Batchelor, also known as King Batch on the internet. I think both of them are fairly weak in their delivery and their timing. You can kind of tell in ensemble cast that it's hard to know whether this film, I think you can kind of tell that some of the lines were improv here and there. It's not a heavily improv movie. It feels very scripted in a lot of places, but it seems like, to me, there were some places where the actors might have had input on a line or two, where we're able to kind of mix it up on different takes to see what line they wanted to do. And I think these two have the weakest lines overall, so whether it was given to them or not, I don't think that their delivery on these lines are very convincing. I don't think the timing is really all that impressive. So this is kind of a spoiler. So skip 30 seconds if you don't want to hear it. But I'm glad that these two are the first to go. It's more fun seeing how they go, obviously, so that's why I really don't consider it all that much of a spoiler, but these two are the first to bite it, and I think that was a smart choice from the filmmakers, because I think they're just the least compelling, not only characters, but also actors in this. But for the most part, I actually think the acting is really strong, even for these side characters who are not in it quite as much or don't have as much character depth. So the parents are played by Leslie Bibb and Ken Marino, and they have some really great comedic moments. You can tell they're seasoned actors. I recognized Ken Marino from a couple sitcoms. He's been in a bunch, and I think Leslie Bibb has as well. So they play off each other really well. You can tell they have sort of this careless demeanor to them that reflects in their son and how he has much more of a codependent relationship with other people. And so that works really well from a story beat, but then I also think that they just have some fun comedic moments. I also think by far my favorite part of this movie is Robbie Amell. He has the right balance of taking his character seriously, or that the character takes itself too seriously, but then also having fun with the role and making sure that he is not getting too serious in it. It's a very self-aware character. He's like shirtless through all the movie, and so I think it's just a very fun role, and he has some really awesome comedic moments. And this will kind of get into the screenplay. There are some really fun scenes in this. I don't think like every scene across the board is all that stellar, but I do think there are some really interesting moments that let these actors shine, and one of those is a scene with Robbie Amell where he's teaching Cole to like stand up to a bully in the middle of trying to kill him. I think it's such a funny scene, and Robbie Amell has this level of wanting to respect this kid even though he also wants to kill him, and he's like kind of rooting for him, and he's like having fun and toying around with him, but not in the traditional villain way. It actually feels like he's trying to be a big brother in a sense. And so he has a very layered performance that plays itself well into this scene in particular. And that's my favorite scene in the movie. But really every line he delivers on point. But then kind of we'll move into the script. So not only is the chemistry built well between the actors, but I also think there are some really great moments in the screenplay that let that chemistry shine. And so that's one of those moments where the scene, you kind of let that scene breathe, you have some fun, it's a break from the action, and it actually builds some character, which is really not something that I would expect in a film like this. This is something that is really out there to just be sort of a fun, gory time. And so the fact that we actually get a scene that gives us a break and gives us some character insight to build upon a character who may not even last all that long in the film is a really impressive aspect of this screenplay that I was very surprised by. But then there are also some other moments that build the chemistry well. I really do like that scene between our two main characters early on where they're talking about like a sci-fi lineup early on in the movie, and so that you get some good back and forth dialogue. I think the group work, particularly in the beginning of the movie, right around that first kill where they're all bouncing off each other, and you can tell that some of these kids really hate each other and some of the other ones really like each other. That builds the chemistry really well, so I really like that scene. And not only do those breaks in intensity that come at certain points to build character work on a character level, but it also gives the viewers a breather. I think the kills are spaced out pretty well. It doesn't stack them all that much. It probably skews a little early for the kills. There are a few pretty early on, but I think that's more to establish the tone, and it's mostly people who don't have any bearing on the overall plot. So having those stacked in the beginning and then spacing it out pretty well afterwards, I think paces the movie really nicely. So then we get to production design, and I wanted to bring that up next because of the fact that the kills are really great in this. I think the gore really works. Most of it is CGI, but I think those kills are pretty creative, which is what you want in a horror movie. There are definitely some moments in this that got me. I was surprised at how gory this movie was. From my previous expectations, it sets itself up as sort of this fun, almost action-y horror movie, and then you get the first kill and whoa, here comes the gore, here comes the blood, which I'm a big fan of. I think if a movie is creative, and this movie is already a silly over-the-top movie, so having that over-the-top gore and kills that realistically don't make any sense but are still entertaining and in a sense cathartic to watch, I think is pretty impressive. So those kills are creative and spaced out, and they're also really not all that predictable, which I also thought was a really nice touch. And then the other parts of the production design, the house is a really great set for a horror movie. Obviously, there's so many sort of haunted house sets or just kind of escape the night in a house. And I think this one really works. You get a sense of where everything is laid out. It's a pretty expansive house. I do really like Cole's room and how kind of childish and immature it is. It's a really great use of space because you can have different kills happening in different places, and there's enough group work with these characters that then can separate and go in different places in the house. So it's in the house and there's some outside, and I think all of those really work for where they are. And then you want some really solid iconography with the costumes, and all of the costumes not only fit the characters, but are really pretty memorable. I actually think the fact that Robbie Amell is shirtless really works for his character, being sort of the dumb jock stereotype, and then Bella Thorne has kind of a revealing cheerleader outfit that I also think really works and is pretty memorable, and I like the yellow. I think that stands out really well. Sonia has a pretty distinct costume that's much more dialed back. It's very monotone in color. So all the costumes are not only memorable, but they're also diverse and so different from each other, which is really all you can ask for in a group horror movie like this. Then the cinematography, in a lot of places, I don't think it's all that special. I think for a comedy, it is much more impressive than a lot of sort of improv-based comedies that are just reverse shot, which I've lamented about before. So it's a bit more stylized than that. So I think we get some good close-ups. I think the action is pretty easy to follow. You get to see the kills in all their glory in most circumstances. And then there's some really great stylized moments. I'll talk about this a little bit more even in the sequel because I think they kind of ramp it up in the sequel. But there's some fun moments of the camera being in places that you wouldn't expect, moving around in a longer take or a closer shot than you would expect. There's also some freeze frames in this that make it a bit more stylized that then flows into the editing really nicely because there are some moments with like words on screen that I wasn't expecting that is pretty unique. Obviously, it's been done before, but it works really well here. The editing is also pretty fast-paced, so you never get bored, which would be kind of the cardinal sin in a movie like this. By no means was I ever bored here. And then there are some really great comedic moments through editing in this. Some of those happen in the way of those words. Some of them happen in some music cues, but I think all of them are, or most of them are born out of the editing, while the rest of them come through that dialogue and performance. And then for the sound, there are some on-the-nose songs, but in a film like this, that really works. I would honestly be a little bit less entertained if the songs were more nuanced. I liked how specific and on the nose they were. And then kind of what I mentioned with the editing, there are some really excellent sound cues. There's a great one in the beginning of the movie where he gets hit with a ball and then you get the title card. I think that sounds really awesome. And it also looks really great. I think it's a very funny moment. There are also great sound cues that add a little stinger to a scene or create a punchline or accent a kill. And so I think all of those really work. Then we get into the directing. I think you can tell that this is more stylized because this director has done music videos fairly often. I do question how self-aware he is as a director sometimes, although I think the tropes in a horror movie are pretty self-aware and he knows what he's trying to do and it's funny in that way. I think some of the jokes and dialogue maybe sometimes feel a little bit too self-referential or maybe a little bit cringy. I also think you can kind of tell the intensity of the male gaze in this film is pretty apparent. I don't want to make any assumptions about this director, but there are some moments in this screenplay and the film and the framing that also appear in the second one that are a bit more, I don't know, insensitive, somewhat inappropriate, that just feel a little gross sometimes. They're pretty few and far between, and maybe people will disagree with me. Maybe people will say that it's a comment about how films had been framed in the past, but I don't think there's any critique that's happening there. I think it is just kind of abiding by those rules and fitting into that slasher trope of objectifying women. But then it also does that with Robbie Amell. It objectifies him pretty blatantly. So maybe it's more self-aware than I think. But part of me is not quite sure on that front. It is self-aware in some aspects, but maybe not in some others. But overall, I think he made a very fun, good movie. Is it accidentally good? Maybe. Maybe there are some moments that were not even as intentionally funny as initially intended, but they all really work. I think he's created this sort of potentially cult classic movie about a cult of teenagers. Very, what's a good example? Scream meets Breakfast Club meets The Real World. I don't know. I think there are just some really entertaining influences that make for a hell of a good time. So I'm going to give The Babysitter, for me personally, I'm going to give it a solid 8 out of 10. I think it's super fun. It's one of those potentially guilty pleasures. But again, if you like something, why is it a guilty pleasure? Just have fun. I think it's a really great, really entertaining time. So I would recommend The Babysitter for sure if you want to have a good laugh with some friends and watch a fun, gory movie to get you in the Halloween spirit a little bit early. So next up, we're going to be talking about the sequel, which came out this past Friday, called The Babysitter Killer Queen. Then I'm going to be giving my weekly recommendation called Ready or Not. Then stay tuned until the very end, where I talk about my top 5 satirical horror movies of all time. But for right now, we're going to take a quick break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my review of The Babysitter. I'm now going to be talking about the sequel, The Babysitter Killer Queen. Then I'm going to be giving my weekly recommendation of Ready or Not. And stay tuned until the very end, where I talk about my top 5 satirical horror movies of all time. But right now, let's get into The Babysitter 2, baby! The Babysitter Killer Queen. I was stoked for this movie. I can't stress really enough how much I enjoyed The Babysitter. I think it's so fun. Obviously, you heard that review. I kind of raved about it in ways that maybe it didn't even deserve, but I love it. It's one of those movies that I can just sit down and always have a good time. So this one, obviously, this is not a movie that I was expecting to be a franchise. I mean, I don't think it is. I think it's just going to get the sequel, but I was not expecting to get a sequel at all. I think it ends pretty conclusively. Is that a word? Conclusatory? No, it's definitely conclusively, right? Somebody correct me on that. Tweet us. GSMC_movies. Thank you. But I by no means was expecting this movie. And then I think it was probably like 2 weeks ago that we got a surprise trailer for this. And I lost my mind. I was so excited to be getting another movie in this series, or now series, that I could just have some fun with. So all I was really hoping for was another movie that was fun and schlocky and it's stupid in its own charming way. And I'm happy to say that's what we got. I was very happy with this. Is it quite as good as the original? No. I think it's weaker in probably a few more areas than I wanted. Sometimes sequels can improve upon what the first one did. I don't think this one necessarily did that in any place. I'm also looking at the Metascore, though, right now, which is currently a 30, and I don't get it. I don't think critics are having fun with this. I think this movie is having a ton of fun. I still think it's got that self-referential flavor to it, and in comparing it to the first, it's a similar tone, similar feeling. It's got very similar comedy, and it really works side by side to the original. So this one follows Cole 2 years later, after he has survived this night of terror, and nobody believes him, including his parents, and they want to put him in a psychiatric high school, which he finds out about. So he decides to, in a sense, run away for the weekend to a lake house with his neighbor/crush from the first movie, played by Emily Allen Lind. Her character's name is Melanie. She plays a much more integral role in this film, but he decides to run away with her and a few of her friends, and then the murder cult is back. He can't escape, and now he's on a secluded island where the entire gang is back to get him. Now, how, you might ask? So I'm going to describe a little bit more of the plot. I would say that if you are really interested in this movie, I would skip this review. It's hard to talk about the extent of the plot without revealing one pretty key secret that occurs earlier on in the film, and then I'll probably talk about some of the kills and some of the moments that are more fun to experience for the first time. So if you're really interested in this movie, I would skip this review, go to the next one, ready or not. I would skip ahead about 15 minutes. So I'll give you a second. All right, so if you're still here, the plot now, Melanie is revealed to be a part of the murder cult. She's bringing on the blood. The torch has been passed down to her and her friends, which was a reveal that I was definitely not expecting. The one thing that I was surprised to find out was that I was surprised in this movie. That's not something I expected at all. I didn't think this movie would really have any twists or turns that would get me. I think most of the movie is pretty predictable, but I was pretty surprised by that revelation that she is now kind of the leader of this cult, or the newer iteration of this cult, and her friends are also a part of it. And then you find out that the older gang is also back in a more undead fashion, but they can still die. Not really explained why. They all do get their heads cut off, so I guess that's probably a part of it, or at least their head's injured. So that's probably how you die in this universe now if you're already dead. But regardless, they're all back, except for B, who is not back right now. But I do think that this plot was more interesting. I think it steps up the stakes a little bit more. We're in a different location. We're now in the middle of nowhere, which is another common horror trope. So I'm glad that it kind of changed location so we could change things up a little bit. We also get a little bit of a rivalry between the two different friend groups. The younger kids led by Melanie, and then the older kids who B isn't there anymore, so there really isn't a leader. I would probably say that Robbie Amell has kind of taken that role, but they also split up for a lot of this movie, so there kind of isn't a leader for this older group of kids. But there are these two groups that kind of don't like each other, kind of have beef with each other, and have a little bit of a competition going as to see who can get Cole first. But Cole now has an accomplice by the name of Phoebe, played by Jenna Ortega. She's kind of the love interest in this one, but she also has a past that we don't know about right away, and we get to see that revealed as the movie goes on. And I was glad to see how well written her character is. I think that she has much more character depth, much more of a personality than Melanie ever did. Melanie gets to play a much more malicious villain in this one. So although I don't think it's an overly complex character, I think it's still fun and entertaining to watch. I think it's a bit more interesting than that first movie. But I would like to say that I think Phoebe is a more interesting character, and I'm glad that she took a little bit of the forefront here. So her character is pretty well written, although there are some moments that are fairly predictable in her backstory. I also just think that there are a lot of predictable moments throughout this movie. I don't think any of the beats, other than that first one where we get the Melanie twist, are all that surprising. It's pretty clear where all of the kills are going to happen. A character gets isolated, they fight the two main characters, and then they die. It's pretty clear, cut and dry. There are some moments where the scene goes a bit longer than you'd expect. Maybe it goes into 2 scenes as opposed to 1, but even still, once the climax of those 2 scenes happen, the person that we've been fighting dies, so that's a little bit predictable. I also think the ending is somewhat predictable, which I was kind of surprised by because it feels like it's a reveal. It feels like the director and the screenplay is like, hey, remember this thing? It came back. Isn't that surprising? But I was kind of expecting it the whole time. So I don't know if it was supposed to be like that, because it feels like a very obvious moment that I think anybody could really predict. But regardless, I do think it works in reference to the script. It's kind of an interesting subversion if it had been done a little bit better. I also think the ending is a little bit of a cop-out. This is in the trailer, so I will say that B is not in this movie really at all until the end of the film, so until that final act, and really the last scene of the final act is when she comes in. And I think the character development evolution of her when she comes back, and the explanation of things is a little bit of a cop-out. We don't really see any of that development. It kind of happens all off-screen, and then because of that, I don't know how much I buy it given her character from the first one, but regardless, I don't think that takes much away from it. I think it could have been a little bit stronger, but hey, that's not the kind of movie I'm looking for. I'm just looking to have fun, and it still is a lot of fun. The characters that I don't think are as fun, I really don't think any of Melanie's crew, any of the new actors, are all that interesting. They don't seem to have much character depth. Even the characters in the first one that are just these archetypes that have some fun lines if they die earlier on and then get some more development if they stay longer, even they have more character and more nuance than these new players. And that's not a discredit to the actors. I think they're doing a perfectly fine job. It's hard to tell really how good of a job they're doing because I don't think any of their lines are written very well, but I don't think they're doing a bad job by any means. I just kind of found these characters somewhat annoying, a little obnoxious, and one of them specifically is pretty clearly a replacement slash foil slash mirror to one of the characters in the older gang, but then the other ones aren't. So it doesn't seem like they serve a purpose in reflecting the older gang, except for one of them, and I found him pretty obnoxious, so I didn't like these characters. Not that I think they should have been taken out, I just think it would have been a lot more interesting, and I don't know, I don't think it's obvious, but I think it just would have made sense if there were the same number of members in this new gang and they all kind of reflected the older gang. It's a trope that's been done before, but I think there's a lot of humor there. I'm thinking Shaun of the Dead when it comes to characters that like reflect the leads. It's more of a one-off joke in that movie, but I think exploring that here would have been fun, and maybe we could have gotten some tag teams between the two gangs as opposed to having them split off separately with each other. Maybe get some new pairings, some older, younger, have some fun character moments. There aren't nearly as many fun character moments as there were in the first one. I think this one is more focused on developing Cole and developing Phoebe, which is fine. I didn't dislike that. I just think it would have been fun to maybe make the movie even a little bit longer. It feels pretty short. It is pretty short. It's like an hour and a half, and it doesn't feel any longer than that, so maybe extend it by 15-20 minutes, add some character moments, flesh out the new gang, add a different or add one or two more characters, and I don't think it would have felt unbalanced because we don't need to establish the older characters. We can just establish the younger ones through the older ones because we already know the older ones and just have some fun comedy there. So that would be my suggestion to enhance it, but I don't think that any of this really takes away from it. I just think it's a little bit weaker than it could have been. Then we get to the acting. Like I said, I think that new crop of kids aren't quite as strong as the older ones, but I also just don't think they have as much character and as much dialogue to go off of that give them that opportunity. So they're just kind of sitting there. We just watch them. I don't really have an opinion on them either way. I will say that King Batch, my guy, did a lot better in this one. I think his timing is a lot more impressive. I don't think all of his lines are great. Oh, I meant to say this in the screenplay. I think the lines are like 50-50. There are some, obviously, like, comedic references that happen in every comedy like this that are like, hey, the real world, here's a joke. Okay, cool. Most of those fall flat, but I think a lot of the, like, puns or character-based comedy work a lot better. So I would cut out some of those references. Andrew Bachelor has a lot of those, but I do think his timing works a lot better. The joke about Jordan Peele got me in the trailer, didn't really get me in the movie. Maybe that comes down to the editing. Maybe it comes down to the fact that it's a joke that only works once. But regardless, he's doing a way better job. I also think that the leads are very charming. I think they do a really great job. Much like the first one, Cole has a really solid sense of his character. He never feels, at least to me, I don't think he plays that sort of like annoying trope of being the outcast, misunderstood kid. I think it actually makes sense that he feels misunderstood. And I think the parts where it feels like he's being a bit annoying, I can't really think of another word for it, about it, it tends to work for the scene that it's in. He does have a pretty drastic switch to being much more confident, but I don't really think that takes away anything. It tends to happen when he's more alone, so in a sense, it does make sense in some ways. But I also really like the addition of Phoebe. Jenny Ortega has a really great performance. You can tell that she's got a secret, both through her performance and through the screenplay. And then when it gets revealed, her character gets a lot more interesting. I think she serves the plot in a really specific way. So she also has a very strong character here. And surprisingly enough, my favorite performance, not my favorite character, my favorite performance in this is Ken Marino, who plays the dad, who is named in this one, Archie. He has a moment early on in the movie where he's talking to his son, who he thinks is going through a lot. He doesn't believe is going through these. He thinks he's going through possibly these psychotic episodes, these schizophrenic episodes. It's not really made clear what it is, but he gives this really caring dad performance at a point. He's like a caring father that wants to believe his son, but doesn't, and it really pains him. And I think it was a fantastic performance in that scene. And then it gets a little more comedic as time goes on. I think that plot line is probably one of my least favorite, but he kind of brings some levity to it. He brings a really fun performance. So I thought he did a fantastic job, and I'm glad that he was in this movie more than he was the first one. Then let's move on to the production design. I think the gore is really impressive here still. It's pretty apparent that it's CGI blood for the most part. I wouldn't be surprised, obviously, if there's some practical blood on set, but you can tell that CGI blood. I don't mind it. I think some places I would prefer going more practical, especially because at the end, most specifically, there are some clear influences from like the Evil Dead, with characters like burning at a certain point, and you can see parts of their skull and their muscles, and it reminds me a lot of the death time lapse at the end of the Evil Dead, and that one is practical, and you can tell how cheesy and gummy it is, but I always find that sort of 80s gore very charming, and because I think this movie is also charming, maybe I would have wanted that a little bit, but it's a little bit harder to do that. It's easier to do CGI, so I didn't mind it overall. I think it still looks pretty good, and I like how over the top it is. Those kills are also still pretty creative. I like the kayak one, it's a surfboard. I like the surfboard one a lot. I also like, it's in the trailer, I think, and it's not technically a kill, I guess, but I like the silly string flammable kill. I think that one is also pretty creative. So there's some unique ones in here, which is always fun to see in a horror movie. If it's just a generic death by gun, who cares? We want to see something creative. We want to see something unique. So you definitely got that in here. The costumes are still iconic. I still like them. They're very memorable, and they work really well here. I don't think that the costumes are nearly as good for the new characters, so I'm not sure if it's a different costume designer, different production team. I wouldn't be surprised, because I don't think the costumes for the newer characters stand out quite as much. I think Phoebe you can remember pretty well, but I also don't think you could really remember Cole's costume from the first one, so I don't think it really matters. So Cole and Phoebe stand out more than the newer crop of characters for the kids, but since they're technically dead, I'm glad that the older kids still have the same costumes, because I really liked those ones from the first one. And then also, as far as set goes, I don't think it's quite as interesting as the house, because it's just outside, so it's mostly exteriors. But I think the cabin is pretty good. I don't think it's anything all that special. It's still kind of a cabin in the woods. And then there are some fun props in the basement of that cabin, but they're also fairly on the nose, so it's not all that special. But the set that I do really like that stands out to me is that final act, the final scene of the third act. That's a cult setting, burning things at the stake. It definitely reminded me of a lot of cult movies, kind of midsummery with that throne. So I liked that set a lot. And I also kind of like, so this is cinematography as well, bleeding into it, transitions, segues. I'm killing it here. I like the orange look. So that is the case on the boat. We get a lot of orange lighting. We also get a lot of orange lighting in the cabin. Then we get outside with the flames of that final set, and it's very orange. So there's a pretty cohesive look throughout the movie that's different than the first one. So I'm glad that they kind of changed the game on that. It adds a little bit of character here that the first one didn't have quite as much. So I'm glad that we got a different look. And then the cinematography, much like the first one, isn't anything to write home about. I think it is pretty functional. It's not as boring as most comedies still. We also get a good look at the action. I think that is probably where it shines out the best. We are always aware of where action is taking place, or at least for the most part. If characters are running around from each other and trying to escape getting killed or trying to kill, we kind of know where everybody's placed. So when a kill does happen or a character interacts with each other, it makes sense, and we have a good sense of space. We know exactly where that's coming from. The cameras also don't stray away from gore at all, which is awesome. I love seeing the kills kind of up close, and they're pretty quick, so I don't think it's any, like, it doesn't hurt to watch if you're not a huge fan of gore. I mean, if you're not a huge fan of gore, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. This one is kind of gory, but there are some pretty graphic scenes that I wasn't expecting to really see the full extent of. So that last scene where we get kind of that Evil Dead-esque look, we get to see a lot of that. There's also a scene where a character gets their head ripped off, and I thought that looked awesome, where the neck kind of stretches and then snaps. So I think that looked excellent. I'm glad that the camera didn't shy away from any of that. The editing is still quick. I would say maybe it's a little bit slower than the first one, but I don't think that's a credit to the editing. I think that's just the structure of the movie, the fact that these characters kind of split up at a certain point, and we're focusing more on the development of the two main characters than we are the overall comedy and the gore. But I think it's still pretty stylistic. There's a scene that is, not a rip-off, but pretty clearly inspired by Scott Pilgrim. I do like that fight scene. It's not obviously as impressive as it is in Scott Pilgrim, but I like it here. I think it works for the tone of the movie. There is another scene where the words pop up on screen. I like that. There's a callback to the first one with the introduction and the title card. So there are some fun stylistic editing choices that are probably more frequent than they were in the first one. So I'm glad it kind of heightened things there. The sound, I think the songs are a little bit more generic than the first one, because the first one was like on the nose, so it made sense when a song choice was there, and it was kind of like calling attention to itself, which I thought was fun. That's not quite as much the case here. There is definitely a few instances of that, in particular Alice in Wonderland. There's a reference there, that there's an obvious song choice. There's also the title song, Killer Queen, happens at a certain point, which I think really works. But then there's also kind of just some generic party songs that I don't think there's all that creative choices being made. It doesn't take anything away. I just maybe would have wanted something a bit more interesting. And I like the sound design. I don't think it's creative, honestly, in any way, but it does the job. You can make out footsteps. You can also make out if there's like a car or a snake at a certain point, and it adds to the life of the world, and it stands out pretty apparently. So I think the sound design is very solid. The directing is still self-aware, still having fun. All the actors are having fun. You can tell that it was, I mean, I hope, it seems like it was a blast to make a movie like this. I would love to be involved in a project like this. There are still some moments that feel a little insensitive to me. Little male gazy. There's also a scene where one of the characters points out all of the different types of medications kids are on, and some of that feels a little insensitive. It's not crossing the line in any way, just maybe didn't need to be there. So there are still some moments of that, but I didn't expect anything less ultimately. So this one is still very fun. I don't think it's quite as fun as the first one. I think it focuses more on the main characters, who are just a little bit more boring than it does like the kills and the comedy. So maybe would have wanted some more of that, would have wanted to flesh out the two gangs interacting with each other, add some sympathy there, maybe some fun character moments that were missing compared to the first one. But overall, still a good time, still fun to watch, and I enjoyed it all the way through. I'm going to give this one a solid 7 out of 10 this time. Maybe a soft 7, but either way, still a great time. So I can recommend it. Go check it out. If you want to watch these two in order, I think it'd be a great movie night. So can highly recommend the two of them. I just think go into it expecting a fun, cheesy, good time. But next up, I'm going to give my weekly recommendation, which is Ready or Not, and then finally stay tuned until the final segment where I talk about my top 5 horror movie satires of all time. But right now, we're going to take another quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have given my reviews of The Babysitter and The Babysitter Killer Queen. Now I'm going to be talking about my weekly recommendation of Ready or Not, and stay tuned until that final segment where I talk about my top 5 horror film satires of all time. But right now is Ready or Not. It's not quite a satire, but it definitely follows that similar tone. It is very similar to The Babysitter. In fact, I didn't do this intentionally, but it's the same lead again. So this is the third film of the day where Samara Weaving is in a titular / leading role, which is great. She has a knockout performance in all of these movies, but particularly Ready or Not. I think she is really killing the game right now. And I'm happy to recommend all 3 of these films, and her as an actor. I'm happy to talk about her in all 3 of these movies. But Ready or Not is a film from 2019 that follows Grace on her wedding day as she marries into a family who has a very rich family who has their enterprise off of board games. It's basically the equivalent of like a Hasbro or a Mattel. This is the Ladamus family. And to be officially a part of the family, every new member of the family has to select a game from a plethora of games, and it just so happens that she picks hide and seek, where she is the only one that has to hide from the rest of the family, and the chaos that ensues follows the family trying to kill her throughout the night because of a potential deal with the devil. And so she basically has to survive the night. So it's a ridiculous premise. Again, not really a satire of horror tropes. It's more of just a tongue-in-cheek, fun horror movie that's supposed to be over the top on gore. But what's really surprising here is that it actually has some really solid insight and messages, observations on what it is to be in a marriage and family and tradition or legacy. So I actually really like a lot of this film. And so this might be a little bit of a shorter review because I haven't seen this film as recently as I would have liked to. I saw it when it came out, which was more or less a year ago. So when I was watching some of the videos to prepare for this review, I forgot how much I liked this movie. I love this movie. I think I ranked it probably like 6 or 7 on the year last year, but in rewatching some of these videos, I think that would go a lot higher. In fact, stepping out of that movie, I was hard-pressed to find really any problems. Is there any aspect of the movie that could have been better? Probably, like any movie. But for the movie that it is, I think it's one of those perfect films. It's hard to say that. I know a lot of people will disagree with me, but in my mind, I think of a perfect film as something where everything works for that movie. There's nothing that I really would have changed that I think would have improved the movie, and that's the case here. I think everything works for the movie that it is. It's exciting. It's fun. There are some pretty shocking twists. It's gory as all hell. It doesn't take itself too seriously and has some really excellent characters and performances. So let's get into it. Samara Weaving, even more so than The Babysitter, has an absolute out-of-this-world performance. She's in almost every scene. She carries this entire film. She's both a caring and resilient protagonist. She's a great vessel for the audience. She's learning about all these developments almost at the same time that we are. We might learn about a few before she does, but it's pretty close to it, and realistically, most of the time, her reaction is our reaction. She doesn't make too many dumb decisions. She makes a lot of believable choices, and the decisions that feel a little bit out of place in our minds is because we're working in a rational mindset. She is not, so they make a lot of sense. So she's likable, she's powerful, she gets this entire film. and it's entertaining to watch her the entire time. I think she deserves a ton more leading roles, and I love her in this one. I also really think that the rest of the characters are almost just as likable. And I'm not saying likable as like we like them as a character. They are really bad people, but I mean that they are extremely enjoyable to watch. They're interesting. They're different than a lot of villains. I really like how they're both, or like a lot of them. So this is kind of a big umbrella. There's a lot of different characters, but they have their own kind of character functions, and sometimes we get a bit more insight on a few of them, particularly like the brother-in-law and the husband, and then sometimes the mother. But I think they're really different because they're not just like evil. They have a specific motive. They're also really vulnerable in a lot of places. Some of the characters are really clumsy, which really works. They're also very annoying a lot of times. So I like the differences between these characters. Every character that has a scene with her in a specific moment, that interaction feels believable. It makes sense. The type of character that it is also works for what time frame it is in the movie. So sometimes the more comedic characters will have interactions earlier in the movie, and then the more serious ones are later. And then sometimes if there is a comedic one in towards the end of the film, it's going to break things up a little bit more and give you a little bit of levity for the end of the film that's much more intense than the rest of it. But I just like how nuanced and diverse these characters are from a personality point of view. And then I also just love Samara Weaving in this role. So I mentioned earlier that all of these choices are believable. I also think that goes for the rest of the characters. The fact that they're out for blood and some of them don't seem like they should be. When we get some insight as to why some of these characters are doing what they're doing, it makes sense. I think all of that is very reasonable. There's like one or two kind of twisty, turny moments in the movie, and I think they're set up really well. I also don't think that they're predictable. Sometimes they might be like, okay, we kind of know where this is heading. I'm expecting this to happen, but I don't know how it's going to happen, and I don't know when. So I'm glad that they left some of that up for imagination that then happens later on in the film where we might not have been expecting it. So in that sense, you never know the direction. I also like how well the set is used. Probably not the entire house. It's a massive house, but a lot of the house is used, and then we move to the exterior, much like The Babysitter. It's actually structured very similarly to The Babysitter. Tonally, these three films are, they work really well together. They are very similar. But the moments where she gets some space from the family and gets outside, and there's a couple scenes where she's really only by herself, and that's where her performance really shines through. And then we also get some cool symbolism with her character, like literally rising from a grave or getting nailed through her hand. There's some pretty obvious symbolism that I think works for a movie like this. And then I mentioned that house. That's part of the production design. The production design is fantastic in this. The house is old. It feels very rustic. It feels foreign in a way. Adds to the horror elements, very haunted housey. It has a pretty distinct look from other horror movies. I like the very dark orangey yellow look, and then having it be very old-fashioned with the props, the weaponry, the wallpaper, the record player, the housing. It's all very coherent and symbolic. It sets itself apart from other horror movies, particularly horror movies that are kind of not like massive budget, but also not like a super indie horror movie that then gets released and has a pretty big marketing campaign. I saw a lot of trailers for this. A lot of those movies, I've mentioned this before, are not quite as entertaining, they're entertaining, but just like rely on jump scares, not as well made. This one sets itself out from the bunch, both in how good of a quality it is, but then also the look and how unique it is. And then the thing that I think stands out the most is the wedding dress. I love that she wears it the entire movie. I think it really adds to the symbolism. It adds to her character. It adds some much needed specificity in the horror genre. And I think I watched somewhere that like she had like 17 wedding dresses, and then the doubles had 17, and then the stunt team had 17, so they really put a lot of effort into this wedding dress, and I'm glad they did, because I think it's such a specific look that adds some dimensionality to the movie, which I absolutely adore. The cinematography is pretty impressive because it has some well-established space throughout the movie. The location feels like a character. We also get a good sense of all the characters through the framing. The group shots as well as some of the action shots really work here. And then I also think it's impressive because of how good everything looks in low light. This entire film is pretty dimly lit to give it that unique look. And so I'm glad that the cinematography looks so good with that style, because the style really adds something to the movie, and then we get to see everything and nothing feels like it's caught in the shadows unless it should be. So the cinematography in that sense is really excellent. Then the editing, the flow is excellent. It flows very naturally in a story progression way from different settings, from scene to scene. There's a lot of different storylines going on here, a lot of different subplots, and we get the right amount of time allotted to each of them. I also like how there's a big section in the movie, multiple different sections where she's alone, and so I like that we get some time to spend with her. We get to breathe a little bit, but then we're also kind of on edge. It adds some nice tension when we're alone with her. The moments that are much more intense, that are really suspenseful, where you as a viewer feel like you're on edge, I think are spaced out really well. So there's never too many at a time. It's not stacked on each other, because I think this movie is much more about having fun. It's not one of those movies that wants you to like leave in a bad mood or leave in a mood that you feel like you're absolutely terrified from. It's really just an awesome popcorn horror movie. The sound, too, I think the score is probably the least interesting here. It's pretty kind of like traditional symphonic, intense where it needs to be. But in any horror movie, if you don't have that type of score, I don't think those moments work as well. So I'm glad that it's there. I also really like the choice, though, of the hide and seek song. I think that adds some creepiness to it, because I think this movie would be lacking a little bit if it didn't have that creep factor, because we're supposed to be scared and it's supposed to be intense. It's kind of like a horror action in a way, but we don't have that looming sense of like somebody's watching you, somebody's always around the corner, which is necessary in a movie not only about a deal with the devil, but also in a movie about hide and seek. That's literally what hide and seek is about. So that song adds a lot to the world of the film. But overall, you can just tell that everybody is having a blast making this movie. They're having so much fun. There's a lot of like practical effects here. The gore is obviously enhanced in post, but there are some fantastic uses of practical blood and blood splatter, which is something that I am always excited to see in a horror movie. And then I'm going to tell you to skip about 2 minutes if you don't want any spoilers, which if you haven't seen this movie, I recommend not getting it spoiled for you, because I love this ending, but I want to talk about it. So, the ending. All right, if you're still here, I hope you've seen it, because the ending is so fun. Oh my god, I love when a movie hints at something that it could do, and you're like, they're not going to do that. That's crazy. Why in the world would they do that? And then they do it, and they have the guts to pull it off, and it works so well. The fact that the pact was real and the family all bites it in the end is so awesome. It feels very Cabin in the Woods, where it's like, here's this thing that's hinted out. They're not going to do that. Oh my god, they did that. And it is so excellent here, and it gives some really great catharsis for both the audience and the main character. And then that final shot where the house is on fire, her dress is drenched, and she's smoking a cigarette, and she gives that punchline of what happened to you, and she's just like, in-laws. It's so good. It's so fun. It's tongue-in-cheek. The entire movie is like that. It's intense where it needs to be. It's fun where it needs to be. It has some really solid character-based comedy where it's not trying to be funny, but because of the believable interactions between characters and the choices that are being made, her reactions to things breeds for some really hilarious humor. So I think Ready or Not is extremely underrated. Since it's come out, it's kind of flown under the radar, but it is streaming on Hulu. I think this is one of those movies that I wouldn't be surprised if it gains some notoriety in the upcoming years, because it's on streaming. I highly, highly recommend this one. I'm going to give it a solid 9 out of 10. It's awesome, and in a lot of ways, perfect in my mind. So that's Ready or Not. Highly recommend you go check that out, and make sure you stay tuned until the final segment of this episode, coming in just a second, where I talk about my top 5 horror satires of all time. But right now, we're going to take our final break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have given my reviews of The Babysitter Killer Queen, and Ready or Not. And right now I'm going to be talking about my top 5 horror satires of all time. So I've mentioned this before on the podcast, but there's a pretty clear distinction in my mind of satire and parody. So satire is something that it has something to say. It doesn't even need to be funny in a lot of senses. I think that word is used interchangeably, but a satire is making a point. It's making a critique of something, and that is all over the place in the horror genre, and most of the time, those are my favorite kinds of horror movies. So you're not going to get like your scary movie on this list. That's much more of a parody. It's pretty clearly making a joke about a specific horror film or horror films across the board, but in this one, these are horror films that have some sort of critique in them, whether it be social or a critique of the genre. And so let's get it started with my number 5 on this list. Number 5 is Get Out. So I love Get Out. I think it is an excellent horror film. It's a satire of race and how that works in sort of the post-Obama, post-racial, quote-unquote, America that we're supposed to be living in that is pretty apparent that we're not. It's a critique kind of like the liberal fetishization of black people that's ultimately still rooted in white supremacy from the perspective of a black American, ironically enough, played by a black Brit, Daniel Kaluuya, who has a fantastic performance. It's scary, it's timely, it's deeply, deeply original. It's funny in places, it's ironic in places, it has something that it really wants to say, and Jordan Peele is such a fantastic voice in the directing world, in the horror world, so I would be remiss if I didn't put him on the list somewhere, and I think Get Out is kind of his crowning achievement right now, but I wouldn't be surprised if he puts out something even better in the future, because I can only see him growing from here, so that's why I put it on the list. Now, number 4 is another movie from a very critically acclaimed director, one that I absolutely adore, and this is called The Host by director Bong Joon-ho. This is one of his, it's like one of his first few feature films, and it's also one of the first ones to blow up overseas, not just in South Korea, because he's a South Korean director. This is one that is not in English, so you're going to need some subtitles, but if you haven't heard of this film, it's basically a giant monster movie that is both a class critique and also kind of a comment on climate change and how that affects specific people. I think it is very funny in its character choices and its irony. It's also deeply sad in a lot of moments. It has a fantastic action-filled climax. I love the design of the creature. It's both like weird and creepy. It stands out pretty distinctly from the pack. It's another very original film that has something to say. Bong Joon-ho is really great at making class critiques, and this one, in a lot of ways, is more subtle, I think, than some of his other ones, as it's focused in its ecological commentary. Monster movies have always been a very fascinating comment on the state of our world, and most of the time, the state of the country that it's coming from, and this one follows that trend, so I really love The Host. I think it's supremely underrated, and if you haven't already seen it, go check that one out. So number 3 is going to be a tie, because these ones are not really a social commentary, but more of a critique of the horror genre, making a comment on specific tropes, and so I wanted to do one. So I really like both of these films, and I wanted them to be on the list, and it's only a top 5, so that's my excuse, but one of them is more of a critique of 80s horror films, specifically slasher films, and the second one is a critique of sort of the teenagers lost in the woods, cabin in the woods trope. So you can probably guess what that one is. That one is Cabin in the Woods, tied with The Final Girls. And I wanted to put The Final Girls on this list because I think that one is also very underrated. It kind of follows a group of modern day teenagers who get caught in an 80s slasher flick, specifically a flick that involves the main character's mother as an actress, as she passed away very early on in our main character's life. So not only does this film make a comment on slasher flicks and a lot of those tropes, specifically, obviously, the trope of the final girl, but it also makes some comments and has some messages about trauma and relationship bonds and family and motherhood. And so I really like all of the messages that it's trying to send. It has some really fun comedic performances. It's a pretty, across the board fun movie. It's not too intense if you're not a huge horror movie fan. The ending is really over the top dramatically. It's also a big action set piece. Has some beautiful set work, some beautiful scenery. The colors are great. The ensemble cast I love. I'm a big fan of Thaisa Farmiga. I love Thomas Middleditch, Adam Devine. So I think there's a really great cast here, and I think this one's pretty underrated. But I have always been a huge fan of The Cabin in the Woods. It was one of my favorite movies for a very long time. It is directed by Joss Whedon. It follows a group of kids as they rent a cabin in the woods and then get tortured by a zombie family. But the little twist there is that the zombie family is being brought on by a secret government organization that has to have sort of a blood ritual sacrifice, or the old gods will rise and take over the world. So it's an even crazier premise. Not only does it critique the cabin in the woods genre of filmmaking, but also pokes fun at kind of every other genre, all of the ridiculous horror creatures and how they function in each of their respective tropes or respective films. It also makes some comments about foreign horror films. I really like the comment about Japanese horror. So all of the horror tropes are commented on and justified in a way, so that's super fun to watch. It also has probably my favorite jump scare in any movie because it comes out of nowhere and doesn't work for the setting. So that title card is really excellent, and I love Cabin in the Woods. It's super fun to watch in a group if you haven't already seen it. So that's why it's number 3 along with The Final Girls. Now number 2 is another set of 2 movies, but this one isn't really a tie. It's more of a pairing because these 2 films are sequels. Well, one's not a sequel of the other, but one is a sequel. It's a pair. This is Evil Dead 1 and 2. People may disagree with me, but I actually like the first Evil Dead a little bit better. I love how tongue-in-cheek the gore is. At the time, this was one of the goriest movies ever made, and I like how over the top the gore and the violence are. A lot of people think that Evil Dead 2 is the more comedic, satirical parody film, but I actually think that Evil Dead is just as satirical in the way that it makes a comment and kind of a fool of itself in how over the top all the gore is. I couldn't help but find it funny. It doesn't take itself seriously in the way that I think a lot of fans might take it seriously. So that's the reason why I love Evil Dead. I thought it was extremely funny, but Evil Dead 2 is just as funny, and it's more intentionally funny. It's making specific jokes, and I think my favorite part of it is, I'm going to condense this a little bit, but this is kind of some film history that I find very fascinating. So the first film is called The Evil Dead with a "the." The second one is Evil Dead 2 without a "the," and that's because The Evil Dead was Sam Raimi's first real feature film. It was kind of a student film. It was very low budget, scrapped together with a bunch of friends. And so when he sold the distribution rights, he actually sold the name of the film. So he didn't retain the rights of his own film. So when he wanted to make a sequel, the studio didn't want to make a sequel, so he went somewhere else. I hope I'm getting all of the nuance of this right. I'm probably oversimplifying things, but this is kind of what I remember to the best of my knowledge. But because he didn't own the rights to The Evil Dead, he could still make Evil Dead. And so the very first, 5 minutes of Evil Dead 2 is an extremely quick comedic recap of the first movie because he doesn't technically have the rights to the first movie. So he wanted all of the events in this version of the universe to be canon. So he put that in the beginning of the movie. And I think it's extremely funny, works really well. It's a very fun commentary on that first movie. And so that's kind of his way of retaining the rights to the story while keeping the title Evil Dead and scrapping the. And so then, kind of side note, he produced another movie more recently, which is a remake of The Evil Dead called Evil Dead, and it's both in canon of the universe, so it's kind of a soft reboot / remake of the first one, and it's actually very good. It's still kind of that more modern, over-the-top gore. It's a little bit different, a little bit more serious in tone, but I do think it makes some interesting commentary about loss and trauma, and then also some of the more modern tropes, and it's very, very gory, and fits in the spirit of that series because of the fact that Sam Raimi helped produce it, so I would recommend that one as well, but I'm not putting that one at number 2. I'm putting the original first 2 Evil Deads, The Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2, at my number 2 spot. Now, number 1 is my second favorite horror movie of all time. I absolutely adore this movie. I think you're probably expecting it because it's pretty much on everybody's list of top horror satires. So this one's Scream. I could not put Scream on this list. It reinvented the genre. It makes comments about horror movies and also how the public responds to horror movies, as well as how the public responds to actual tragedy and actual horror in the real world. I love the twist. It's not as big a twist now because it's not really unexpected as to who the killer could be as far as like age goes, but at the time this was never really done and actually created some copycat killers in the wake of its release, which many people called for Wes Craven to apologize for the movie, but the film is actually making a comment about how movies are not at fault for when things happen like that. In fact, it's much more of society's fault when they let things like this be glorified in the media or glorified on television. So it's a really smart social critique as well as being a critique of horror films in a way that I think the rest of these movies don't do nearly as well. All of the films on this list do one or the other pretty well, but I think this film does both even better than all of those other ones. So Scream is far and away the best horror satire, as well as being one of the best horror films ever, so it just works on kind of every level. Much like other horror films, it's a great group watch, but it's also very satisfying to watch it by yourself, try and solve the mystery, and then if you've already seen it, try and spot some of the other hints laid out through the film, as well as some of the other commentaries in Scream. So that's my list. I hope you guys liked it. If you have any other opinions, agree, disagree, want to give me your list, want to give me some suggestions, tweet us at GSMC_movies. I would love to hear your thoughts. And as always, thank you so much for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to remind you to please subscribe to the show if you haven't already, as well as leave us a nice review, because that really helps us. And if you could follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I have been your host, Casey Baum. Thank you, and have a good one.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.